Although he's probably best known as the admiral who led the 2nd Pacific Squadron on what turned out to be a rather disastrous round-the-world voyage, which ended in an even greater disaster at the Battle of Tsushima, Zinovy Petrovich Rozhestvensky was in fact a very accomplished Russian naval officer with quite an extensive and impressive background. Today, we're going to have a look at pretty much what he did before he took command of the 2nd Pacific Squadron. With advanced apologies to anyone who actually speaks Russian, because, well, my Russian pronunciation is probably going to be shown up as horrifically bad as we go on, but I'm going to try my best. Zinovy Petrovich Rozhestvensky was born on October the 30th, or November the 12th, 1848, depending on if you use the Russian calendrical system that they were using at the time, or the one that we all use now. In any case, his father was a military doctor, and as such, he had no family connections to help advance his naval career, as having patronage, as it was loosely termed, was still very helpful if you were trying to advance up the ladder of the Imperial Russian Navy. Fast forward almost 16 years, and he was admitted as a cadet to the Naval Cadet Corps after passing his entrance exams. During his service in the Corps, Rozhestvensky quickly became known as a diligent student with quite significant naval aptitude, particularly in the field of artillery, tactics, and naval history. However, there were a few black marks on his book. Specifically, his work could be occasionally inconsistent. He had a reputation as a very prideful young man, and, worst of all, in the view of his superiors, he had an incredibly uncompromising attitude toward perceived incompetence. That wasn't such a bad thing when he was getting his fellow cadets into order, but if he thought one of his instructors was not doing their best, he had a habit of letting this be known as well. During his time as a cadet, he would go to sea for the very first time in 1865 aboard the screw frigate Gromoboy, which was sailing around the Gulf of Finland, and in 1868 he would graduate at the age of 20, ranked 5th in his class, which meant he would be commissioned as a midshipman. To come 5th out of a class of 44 when half his instructors seemed to want him hanged from the yardarm for pointing out their own failings was quite the achievement. However, the antagonism he'd earned from his instructors was shown in the graduation ceremony itself. Rear Admiral Rimsky-Korsakov completely failed to mention Rozhestvensky's name when he was listing the top graduates of the year, and he was also not awarded the Admiral Nakhimov Award, which traditionally at the time was given to the top 6 cadets in the class. Nonetheless, his skills were recognized by officers outside of the military schools, and he quickly began to serve aboard a variety of Russian warships, mostly modern, under the command of a series of rather distinguished Russian naval officers. He quickly began to specialize in artillery, which is perhaps unsurprising to us, given his demonstrated aptitude for that subject all the way back in the academy. However, it was a relatively uncommon focus for an Imperial Russian naval officer of the time, as it was still seen as a little bit of a lower decks duty as compared to the fine arts of navigation and command. But in any case, he was advanced to the rank of ensign on April the 17th, 1870, and later in the same year he came off of sea duty and joined the Mikhailovsky Artillery Academy to increase his expertise in the field of naval artillery. By May 1873, he graduated from the academy with distinction, top honours, and a resulting annual salary bonus, which was quite nice. Apparently he didn't manage to tick off enough instructors at the Artillery Academy, or else he was just having so much fun he forgot to do so. From there, as well as commissions at sea, he joined the Naval Artillery Testing Commission and would take that expertise out to sea in various practical exercises when various Russian fleets deployed for regularly scheduled war games. But As the 1870s drew on, there was rising tension with the Ottoman Empire once again. This time it was concentrated in the Balkans because, of course, everybody knows the Balkans aren't allowed to go for more than 2 decades without some kind of war breaking out either in or over them, and in April 1877 Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire. At this point, the Russian Navy was in a rather interesting position. On paper, they had 29 ironclads either in service or under construction, but 19 of them were designed purely for coastal operations, which left them with very few deep water ironclads, and of course these were split between the Baltic and Black Sea fleets. Conversely, the Ottoman Empire, thanks to the efforts of Sultan Abdul Aziz, who had been a little bit profligate with his naval spending, the Ottoman Navy was in possession of 13 sea-going ironclads, 2 more that were technically coastal but might make it around the waters of the Black Sea, and 7 river monitors. That fleet included a number of particularly large vessels, including the Mesudaye, which would go on to have an extremely long career, and by comparison the Russian Black Sea fleet had, once again, drawn the short end of the straw in a conflict with the Ottomans, as the vast majority of the Russian ironclad fleet was stationed in the Baltic. The only active ironclads in the Black Sea fleet were the Novgorod and the Popov, the 2 little circular coastal defence ships. And thus, the Ottomans managed to command the Black Sea with about the same level of control as that which had been enjoyed by the Anglo-French alliance during the Crimean War, which is to say pretty much total. However, this time there would be no Royal Navy Marine Nationale team-up to help out the Ottomans, as, thanks in part to this level of naval control, they decided that the Ottomans could do this one on their own and they were going to sit back and enjoy the popcorn. But what the Ottomans had at sea, it seemed they lacked on land, and soon Russian armies were advancing down both sides of the Black Sea. The Black Sea Fleet, therefore, decided that since they weren't going to take their 2 little disc-shaped ironclads into a fleet battle with the entire Ottoman Navy, they were going to resort to underhanded tactics using brand new technology. In order to do this, they first found 19 fast merchant steamers of relatively small displacement and modified them as tenders for small steam-powered launches or boats, which they then armed with a variety of weapons, primarily spar torpedoes, towed Harvey torpedoes, and eventually, when they could get their hands on them, some of the new self-propelled or locomotive torpedoes. Since they'd also pioneered the use of mines all the way back in the Crimean War, they decided to deploy a few of those as well. Their first target was the Ottoman Danube flotilla, which consisted of 2 small ironclads and several monitors. The first operations by the Russian ships sowed a series of mines at the mouth of the river, and this was followed up by field artillery bombardment from the army ashore and attacks from the torpedo boats with the aim of either hitting the Ottoman ships or forcing them to change position quickly, which might run them therefore into the minefields. On the 11th of May 1877, they claimed their first victim when Russian army shore guns managed to sink the small armoured ship Lutfu Selil, I think at least that's how it's pronounced. And a couple of weeks thereafter, one of the small steam-powered torpedo boats armed with a spar torpedo managed to sink a small river monitor, the Saifi. Improvised offensive and defensive tactics were soon devised by both sides, but in the middle of all of this were 2 young Russian officers, Stefan Makarov and, of course, Zinovy Rozhestvensky. Although a number of Russian attacks failed because the launchers couldn't get close enough to their targets with either their spar or towed torpedoes, thanks in part to Ottoman defensive countermeasures and in part to some of the Ottoman ships seeing them coming and just steaming away, Rozhestvensky, in command of torpedo boat number 2, during one attack managed to get past the rope barrier or boom that the Turkish ironclads had put in his way, but then his spar torpedo exploded when it hit a second barrier, torpedo nets which had been deployed to protect specific ships, in this case his target, as well as the more general nets which he'd managed to bypass. The resulting explosion almost swamped torpedo boat number 2 and damaged it, but Rozhestvensky managed to get the ship to withdraw. It should be noted that at least one Russian historian, however, maintains that this particular aspect of Rozhestvensky's career never happened, or more specifically that he never commanded torpedo boats. He claims instead that another officer, Lieutenant Vladimir Romanovich Rozhestvensky, was in fact the one who commanded said torpedo boat, and attributes the confusion to the fact that both lieutenants had the same last name, and there were no initials on the official documents of the Russo-Turkish War that recorded what various officers did. Although on the flip side again, I should note that the vast majority of sources I found on this particular conflict do attribute the action to Zinovy Rozhestvensky, so take that as you will. However, one problem with deploying these nets and booms was that it pretty much immobilized the ships inside until you could go through the lengthy process of removing them. And as a result, the Russian army field artillery started to get its own results in, damaging 2 of the Ottoman monitors, followed by the capture of 2 more stationary monitors on the 16th of July, which overall left the Ottomans with just 2 operational monitors out of the 7 they'd originally deployed. A wooden screw gunboat, trying to evade field artillery fire, also ran into a Russian mine and sank in October. In the middle of summer, though, on the 23rd of July 1877, there was the only proper ship-to-ship duel of the conflict that took place in the open sea, when the Ottoman armoured corvette Fethi Bulend, again I think that's how it's pronounced, decided it was going to chase down one of the converted Russian yachts or steamers, the Vesta, aboard which was Rozhestvensky, now as an artillery officer. Depending on which report of the time you believe, the Ottoman corvette was either driven off, disabled, or chose to withdraw of its own accord when it turned out it was too slow to catch the Vesta. Whatever the case, a small, dedicated ironclad warship either outright losing a fight or at least managing a score draw with what was essentially an armed yacht was not a particularly good showing on the Ottomans' part, and gunnery officer Rozhestvensky was awarded the Order of St. Vladimir, 4th class, with swords, and the Order of St. George, 4th class, which were quite significant distinctions for an officer so young. He also netted a promotion to lieutenant commander. Despite having had a relatively successful war, Rozhestvensky ended it having made a few more enemies internally, as he was quite outspoken both during and afterwards about the deficiencies of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, particularly its technical weaknesses and its tactics. He was even quite disparaging of the engagement he'd been part of aboard Vesta, as he thought that it was really a little bit of a retreat, and he thought with his gunnery they might have been able to overcome the considerably better protected and considerably more heavily armed Ottoman corvette. Perhaps because of this, the next half-decade of his career was pretty boring. He was given just standard routine assignments and didn't advance to any further command. During this time, he was mostly back at the Naval Artillery Testing Commission, trying to get newer and better guns out to the Russian fleet, but his dedication to artillery, as well as his achievements in the latest edition of the Russo-Turkish Wars, hadn't gone completely unnoticed. And in July 1883, he was appointed commander of the newly formed Bulgarian Navy. Yeah, that feels like a record scratch moment. How the heck did Rozhestvensky end up being head of the Bulgarian Navy, considering he's not even a flag officer in the Russian Navy at this point? Well, let's rewind time just a fraction. After the aforementioned Russo-Turkish War, Bulgaria, or at least something that vaguely resembles modern Bulgaria, had been broken away from Ottoman rule, which had been a thing for about the past half millennia. The San Stefano Treaty, rather specifically in 1878, established the Principality of Bulgaria. Naturally, the Bulgarians were rather happy with the Russians for having gotten them out from under the Ottoman yoke, and so it's rather unsurprising that various Russian technical specialists, armed forces personnel, and various other representatives of Russian state institutions turned up to help Bulgaria set up its own state institutions, armed forces, and industries. In 1879, the Bulgarian Navy was formed mostly with the objective of protecting the portion of the Danube that flowed through the country. Although, as we've already established, the Black Sea Fleet at this point didn't have particularly great resources, the Russian Navy decided that they were going to donate a number of ships. Well, I say ships. They tabulated the donations as 4 armed steamships, 7 steam launches, a schooner, a barge, and 5 rowing boats, so I think it was more that they were just doing a house clearance. Somewhat more helpfully, they also donated a bunch of ship repair workshops, so at least the Navy wasn't going to fall apart in the next 5 minutes. And as we mentioned, as a result of Rozhestvensky's notoriety from the Russo-Turkish War, as well as his previous good record, and the fact he hadn't managed to step on quite so many toes in the aftermath, the Captain Lieutenant Zinovy Rozhestvensky was appointed as the commander of the military flotilla and head of naval department of the Principality of Bulgaria. Unfortunately, it turned out this was about the only thing the Russians and the Bulgarians agreed on, as the Bulgarian government and its overall military seemed to have no real idea on what to do with a navy, or even if they wanted a navy at all. One of the perennial recommendations that was circulated in Bulgarian politics was to dismantle the entire fleet and auction off the spare parts for a bit of cash. The fact that the donation had lacked icebreakers and Bulgaria didn't have a properly sheltered port for the winter season just yet also meant that during the winter, the entire fleet had to decamp for an overseas holiday in Romania to stop itself being locked in and crushed by ice. And it didn't stop there. The barracks that were assigned to the Navy were poor in many places. Approximately 1/3 of the crew were found to be living in conditions that the fleet's doctors described as appalling and unfit for human habitation. About 1 in 5 of all Bulgarian sailors at this point ended up being hospitalized pretty much every year, with various conditions arising from the fact they were living in cold, damp, drafty environments. And, well, you say naval medical officers and doctors. The entire medical service consisted of 1 paramedic and anybody that he could draft in to help him. All the other doctors came from the army. And when Rozhestvensky showed up, the purpose of the Navy was so unclear that most of the ships were being used as cargo and passenger ships on the Danube to try and pay for themselves. Rozhestvensky raised this issue in a report. He said, "Why should vessels of the military flotilla function exclusively as transports, losing the opportunity to prepare for direct service? Why does public opinion demand that they also transport the families of civilians and their luggage? The answer seems to be that many are entirely unaware that the flotilla is in fact a military force." Having finally gotten through to the Bulgarian government that you did actually need to train your navy if you wanted to be able to fight, Rozhestvensky's next task was to write all the training manuals, because it turned out there weren't any. He quickly drafted up training documents on rowing, sailing, rigging, mine warfare, guard duty, and, of course, naval artillery. A Russian writer who was visiting the area would write, "Walking down a street, I unexpectedly ran into an old acquaintance. Sailor Rozhestvensky, dressed in a Russian uniform, turned out to be commanding the Bulgarian fleet, essentially acting as a Bulgarian admiral. He's doing real work here. Before his appointment, the Bulgarian Navy was a highly peculiar sight. Rozhestvensky, who was capable of working 48 hours straight, immediately put the previously idle fleet into action." Despite, however, his best efforts, there were still a number of issues. Most officers were assigned 2 different roles, which somewhat complicated their ability to operate efficiently. For example, Rozhestvensky himself was the commander of the flotilla, but also the captain of the flagship the armed yacht Alexander I. His assistant was the navigator of the flagship and the first officer, and so on it went, which made the division of responsibilities aboard most ships somewhat unclear. But it was at least a good start. Since there weren't any senior officers to aggravate because he was the senior officer, Rozhestvensky instead turned his attention to the sailors who worked under him. And he found he quite liked them, describing them as a marvellous people, talented, hard-working, and positive. A historian of the Bulgarian Navy would later write, Rozhestvensky energetically set out to strengthen the organisational foundation of the young Danube flotilla, laying the groundwork for the comprehensive and systematic training of its personnel. The measures he implemented had a decisive impact on the successful operations of the flotilla during the subsequent Serbo-Bulgarian War. When he wasn't encouraging his men or writing training manuals, Rozhestvensky was also working on ensuring the infrastructure was up to scratch. He found the least terrible ship repair facility and expanded its capabilities quite significantly. He also made several efforts to try and get smaller ports or docks established along the Danube so that the flotilla had places to stop on its patrol routes, as well as actually finding a port which could be upgraded to a decent winter harbour, although severe financial constraints imperiled these efforts quite significantly. And he really was working on a shoestring. The Bulgarian defence budget was hardly large, but out of that defence budget, the naval flotilla received only 2.5% of the defence budget's allocated funds, with the vast majority going to the army. And so, having gotten somewhat fed up of trying to get a little bit more money out of the Bulgarian government, Rozhestvensky decided he was going to head back to Russia briefly, heading up to St. Petersburg, where he put out a call for volunteers amongst the Russian officer and petty officer cadres to come help him sort out the Bulgarian naval flotilla. He also scoured St. Petersburg for naval engineers to help design docking facilities and then supervise their construction, and after quite a few appeals to the Tsar, he also managed to secure the transfer of 2 relatively modern torpedo boats, 10 ferries, which would be very useful on the Danube, as well as large quantities of essential materials like anchors and explosives, which he could then use in his fleet without having to use his very, very small operational budget. But he didn't get everything he wanted. Although he found a ship that was for sale for a knockdown price, the Bulgarian government refused to buy it to use it as a training ship, and they also refused to release funds for the docks that he wanted to establish along the Danube. Not to be deterred, he switched his defensive plans to mine-laying operations, with the idea that he could block approaches from enemy flotillas on the Danube by first laying a set of mine barriers, behind which would be the torpedo boats and the small launches, so an enemy force would have to either cross the mine barrier at speed and risk hitting a mine, or if they slowed down to try and clear the mines, they'd be easy picking for the torpedo boats. And, well, if they tried to run the minefields, they'd probably still get torpedoed anyway, it would just be a somewhat harder shot. Although his efforts were beginning to pay off, at least in the areas that he could fund, there was a problem. In 1884, various political representatives, particularly from the nobility, called for the dissolution of the navy. Rozhestvensky, however, had finally found someone who in theory was more senior to him, namely the country's nobility, which he could now aggravate, and he went on a bit of a PR spree. Soon, letters of support were flooding in from pretty much everyone who wasn't the Bulgarian nobility, and in January 1885, the Bulgarian National Assembly was trying to pass the state budget and discovered that by popular acclaim, rather than dissolving the navy, they were instead told that they would be increasing the flotilla's budget by quite a considerable amount. More precisely, they were being told that they were going to be giving the Navy 25 times more money than it had gotten the previous year. Unsurprisingly, Rozhestvensky was now able to purchase the training ship he wanted, and he also managed to find a torpedo boat for sale, which brought the fleet's total up to 3. In recognition of his service and the widespread public acclaim, he was awarded the Bulgarian Order of St. Alexander. More of the money was used to purchase ammunition for use in gunnery training. Pretty much all of the ships were put through repairs at the newly expanded dock facilities, and the fleet actually got to spend a significant amount of time away from its home port. Rozhestvensky spent 195 days in 1885 at sea, and some of his sailors spent considerably more. And it wasn't just the ships. He also established a technical society and a naval library to allow officers who weren't assigned to ships at that point to keep up to date with the latest developments. But all good things must come to an end, and on October the 15th, 1885, he was recalled back to service with the Russian Navy, replaced by a Bulgarian captain, one Captain Vankov. But despite his short tenure in command, he'd managed to turn the Bulgarian Navy around from essentially a state-run transportation flotilla that potentially could have been sold off into a small but highly effective river flotilla, with pretty much the only weaknesses that the Navy would demonstrate in the Serbo-Bulgarian War, which was coming up, as mentioned, being the areas that he hadn't been able to get funding for. Now back in the Russian Navy proper, Rozhestvensky resumed his career and found, with the rather nice laurel of having turned around the Bulgarian Navy, plus all his previous accomplishments, he was given a series of rather nice assignments. He was made senior officer on the ship Kreml. Then he was made the senior officer on the relatively new armoured frigate Herzog Edinburghsky, and yes, that is literally Duke of Edinburgh, just in Russian. He would then go on to be awarded the Order of Santa Anna, second class, for his contributions to managing naval artillery and advancing naval gunnery. The 1890s continued to go well. He was given command of the Naznik, I think, as well as a gunboat, the Grozyashi, possibly. Then he was made naval attaché to London, the most important of the naval attaché postings in the Imperial Russian Navy. Then, in 1894, he was given command of the cruiser Vladimir Monomakh. 2 years later, he was given command of the coastal defence ship Pervenets, and before the 19th century could draw to a close, he had been appointed to the Emperor's personal retinue, given command of the artillery training for the Baltic Fleet, which was at that point the most prominent of the Russian fleets, and promoted to Rear Admiral. In November 1899, the brand new warship General Admiral Graf Apraskin was commissioned into service with the Baltic Fleet, and then ran aground on the Hogland Island in the Gulf of Finland. Despite this inauspicious start, there was a degree of hope that the ship might be able to be salvaged, especially since a similar running aground incident a couple of years earlier had cost the fleet the warship Gangert. They couldn't afford to lose 2 ships so quickly. And so the Apraskin's crew were ordered to stay aboard their crippled ship and maintain it as best they could, as the Gulf was about to freeze over for the winter, so there was nothing much that anyone could do about it right now. With nothing much else to do over Christmas, the crew decided to build a small radio station on the island so they could at least keep in contact with fleet headquarters, and in January 1900, Rozhestvensky was ordered to lead the salvage operations. After inspection, it quickly became apparent that towing the ship free was a non-starter. Doing so would cause even more damage to the hull and remove the rocks that were currently stuck in her, which were doing most of the plugging of the flooding, which would mean the Apraskin would almost certainly founder shortly after being towed off. After giving the matter some thought, Rozhestvensky went off and found a nearby civilian-run mining operation, enlisted the aid of some of the miners, and told them to set small explosive charges on the rocks that were holding the Apraskin in place at a suitable distance from the hull. They did this and managed to blow the rocks clear of the rest of the island. This meant that the icebreaker Yermak, which was nearby, could now tow the Apraskin away with the rocks that had stuck in her hull still stuck in and keeping her mostly from flooding. She was then towed back to Kronstadt and given all the necessary repairs. It's therefore perhaps unsurprising that a few years later, as tensions with Japan increased and then boiled over into the Russo-Japanese War, Rozhestvensky was first appointed head of the primary naval staff, which left him with the unenviable task of taking over Russian naval administration right before it was thrust into a major war. And then, after the disasters that attended the first Russian Pacific Squadron, he was given command of the newly formed 2nd Pacific Squadron. Now, of course, we have covered that voyage and the subsequent Battle of Tsushima in extreme detail in other videos, so I'm not going to redo all of that here. But suffice to say that although ultimately Rozhestvensky would lead the 2nd Pacific Squadron to defeat at the hands of Admiral Togo, he had done a remarkable job with the ships and the crews that he had been given in the time he had available, bearing in mind that when the fleet left the Baltic, it could barely maintain a peacetime cruising formation. It had numerous infamous panics about potential Japanese torpedo boats, and when in the grips of one of these panics, despite opening fire at a rather numerous British fishing fleet, they'd managed to inflict almost as much damage on their own ships as they had on the handful of British trawlers that they managed to land shells on, before then fetching up in North Africa, having antagonized a good portion of Europe and being in such a poor state that Admiral Beresford had reckoned he could defeat the entire lot with just 4 pre-dreadnoughts of the Royal Navy, and that was him being sporting. Rozhestvensky then managed to turn them into a fleet that, by the time of Tsushima, random snakes, alligators and parrots taken on at Madagascar aside, could maintain its cruising formation, could at least make a semi-passable attempt at putting itself into a battle formation, despite being at the tail end of an extremely long voyage their machinery really wasn't cut out for, and then, in battle, actually managed to turn in a relatively creditable gunnery performance, all things considered, especially given that they were engaging at ranges that were heretofore unheard of, really let down in part by the fact that Rozhestvensky hadn't quite managed to get them to deploy and sail in a proper battle formation, and partly by the fact that Russian shell design was so obsolete that what hits they did land, whilst they did do some damage, were nowhere near as damaging as similar caliber hits from the Shimose-filled Japanese shells. Really, the fact that the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron lost the Battle of Tsushima is not really all that much of a black mark on Rozhestvensky's book. If anything, the fact that it was actually a battle and not a one-sided curb stomp is a reflection of the fact that Rozhestvensky had done pretty much anything and everything that an admiral could be expected to do, given the hand that he'd been dealt. Rozhestvensky himself was wounded in the course of the battle, but survived and was subsequently released back to Russia. Of course, the finer details of the situation, which we've briefly just covered, didn't really matter all that much to the Russian public, who tended to scapegoat him for the disaster that had happened at Tsushima. But he was tried by a naval court to determine if he was in fact responsible for the defeat, and they acquitted him of being in any way, shape or form directly responsible for the defeat. Rozhestvensky, however, stated that as the officer in charge, ultimately it was up to him to take full responsibility for the defeat, something that some saw as honourable and others saw as perhaps him trying to take the full brunt of the blame onto himself so as not to impinge on the careers of other officers who had survived, since, thanks to his injuries, Rozhestvensky himself was unlikely to stay in naval service for much longer, and therefore if he could retire while taking the blame with him, he could preserve the careers of other officers who he felt deserved this chance. And indeed, after he was acquitted by the military court, Rozhestvensky submitted a request to retire, citing in large part, as most had suspected, the rather significant injuries he'd sustained during the battle. He lived out a few more years relatively quietly in St. Petersburg until on January the 14th, 1909, he died from a sudden and unexpected heart attack. He was then subsequently buried in a small ceremony, but surprisingly for somebody who died in the 20th century, exactly where he was buried was lost for most of the 20th century, as along with a number of other tombs, his headstone and other grave markers were destroyed by the communists in 1920. However, just over a century after that event, his final resting place was tracked down once more, and his grave is now appropriately marked with a small headstone. So there you go, a few more details about the life and career of Admiral Zinovy Petrovich Rozhestvensky, and if those of you who speak Russian happen to know of any more Russian sources that go into his life in more detail, perhaps even a biography, I don't know if one has been written, but if it has, it's probably going to have been in Russian, then please let us know in the comments below, so perhaps we can revisit and expand on some of his other career events. In any case, thank you very much for listening.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.